On the morning of April 18, 1942, 80 men climbed into 16 bombers on the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, knowing that not a single one of them had ever taken off from a carrier before, knowing that the runway ahead of them was shorter than anything a B-25 Mitchell bomber had ever used, knowing that if anything went wrong in those first terrifying seconds of flight, they would plunge straight into the freezing ocean and be crushed beneath the hull of a 60,000-ton warship, and knowing, with cold mathematical certainty, that even if everything went perfectly, there was almost no chance any of them would survive the mission. They went anyway, every single one of them. And what happened next did not just change the course of World War II. It changed the course of history itself. Think about what America looked like in early 1942. Think about what it felt like to be an American in those months. Pearl Harbor had happened just 4 months earlier. On December 7, 1941, the United States Navy had suffered the most catastrophic single military blow in the nation's history. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. Nearly 250 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans dead before most of the country had even finished breakfast. And the shock of it, the raw, gut-wrenching shock of it, had not faded by April. It had deepened, because in the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japan had not slowed down. Japan had accelerated. The Japanese had taken Guam. They had taken Wake Island. They had taken Hong Kong. British Malaya had fallen. The Philippines were falling. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress in Southeast Asia, had surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. 100,000 Allied troops had laid down their arms to a Japanese force roughly 1/3 their size. The psychological damage to the Allied cause was almost incalculable, and Tokyo had not been touched. Not a single bomb had fallen on the Japanese home islands. The Japanese High Command, the military leaders who had planned and executed Pearl Harbor, who had launched this breathtaking campaign of conquest across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, they were sitting in their offices in Tokyo, perfectly safe, reading reports of one victory after another, utterly confident that they had built an impenetrable defensive perimeter around their empire, an ocean-wide wall of distance and fortification that no American aircraft could ever cross. They believed this completely. They had planned for it. They had calculated the ranges of American bombers. They had mapped the distances from American bases. They knew, with the same cold mathematical certainty they had used to plan Pearl Harbor, that the American mainland was too far away for any bomber to reach Japan, and that no carrier in the world could get close enough to Japanese waters without being detected and destroyed long before it could launch aircraft. They were wrong, and the man who was going to prove them wrong was a small, quiet, intensely determined Army Air Forces lieutenant colonel named James Harold Doolittle. Now, to understand James Doolittle, you have to understand that he was not a typical military officer. He was not a product of West Point. He had not risen through the conventional channels of military seniority. He was something rarer and stranger than that. He was a genuine genius, the kind of mind that comes along perhaps once in a generation, and he had chosen to put that genius entirely in the service of flight. Doolittle had earned a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, one of the first people in the world to hold such a degree. He had set world speed records. He had won the most prestigious air racing trophies of his era. And most importantly for what was about to happen, he had pioneered the development of instrument flying, the technique of flying an aircraft entirely by instruments when visibility drops to zero, when there is no horizon to reference, no ground to see, nothing but the cockpit gauges between the pilot and death. Instrument flying seems obvious now. It is the foundation of all modern aviation. In the 1920s and 30s, it was considered nearly impossible, and Doolittle proved it was not only possible but reliable. He was, in short, a man who had spent his entire life proving that things considered impossible were actually achievable, if you were smart enough and brave enough and willing to work hard enough. He was exactly the right man for what was about to be proposed to him. The idea itself came from a Navy captain named Francis Lowe, and it came to him in a flash of insight that sounds almost too simple in retrospect. Lowe was visiting the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia, in January 1942, watching Army Air Forces bombers practicing takeoff and landing approaches. And he noticed something. On the airfield below, someone had painted the outline of a carrier deck on the runway to help pilots practice carrier approaches. And as he watched these big Army bombers flying over that painted outline, something clicked in his mind. He went to Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, and he said something that must have seemed absolutely insane at first hearing. What if we loaded Army bombers onto a carrier, he asked. Big bombers, medium bombers, and sailed them close enough to Japan to launch. The bombers would not need to land back on the carrier. They were too big for that. They would fly onto friendly airfields in China after they dropped their bombs. But for one brief moment, one stunning, unprecedented moment, they would be close enough to drop those bombs on Tokyo. King thought about it. He took it to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Chester Nimitz. And then it went to the Army Air Forces, to General Henry Hap Arnold. And Arnold immediately knew exactly who he wanted to lead it. He called Doolittle into his office and explained the concept. Doolittle, characteristically, did not say it was impossible. He said he would figure out how to make it work. And then Arnold said something that was perhaps the highest compliment he could have paid. He said he wanted Doolittle to select the men and train them, but that Doolittle himself would not be flying the mission. He was too valuable, too irreplaceable, to risk on a mission this dangerous. Doolittle listened to this. He nodded, and then he went away and immediately began planning to lead the mission himself, because there was absolutely no other way he was going to let 80 men fly into something this dangerous without him at the front. The aircraft chosen for the mission was the North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber that was at the cutting edge of American aviation technology in 1942. The Mitchell was not the heaviest American bomber. It was not the longest-range bomber, but it had qualities that made it uniquely suited to this mission. It was powerful enough to carry a meaningful bomb load, fast enough to outrun many Japanese fighters at low altitude, and its fuselage was short enough that, at least in theory, it might be able to take off from a carrier deck. Might. That word carried enormous weight. Nobody had ever tried it. Nobody was certain it was possible. The mathematics suggested it could work. Whether the mathematics would survive contact with a pitching carrier deck and a cold Pacific headwind was a question that could only be answered by actually doing it. Doolittle and his team began their preparations at Eglin Field in Florida, where they had access to a long stretch of runway that they marked off to simulate the length of a carrier deck. The pilots assigned to the mission were volunteers, but they did not know what they had volunteered for. They knew it was dangerous. They knew it was secret. They knew it was important. Beyond that, they knew nothing. They practiced short takeoffs for weeks, learning to lift a fully loaded B-25 off the ground in distances that would have seemed laughable to any conventional aviation engineer. They practiced low-level flying, dropping to 50 feet above the ground to avoid radar detection. They practiced high-speed evasive maneuvers. They stripped their aircraft of equipment they would not need, pulling out the heavy liaison radio sets to save weight, replacing the lower gun turret with additional fuel tanks, because range was going to be everything on this mission. They were going to be flying a very long way, and then they were going to be flying even further. The mechanics of the plan required a kind of navigational precision that was staggering. The Carrier Task Force, built around the USS Hornet, one of the Navy's newest and most capable carriers, would sail west across the Pacific. When it got within approximately 450 miles of the Japanese coast, the 16 B-25s would take off. They would fly west at low altitude to avoid radar detection. They would bomb their targets in Japan, primarily Tokyo but also Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. And then they would fly west again, across the East China Sea, to land at airfields in unoccupied China, primarily around the city of Chuzhou, where Chinese nationalist forces controlled the ground. The total distance from launch to landing was approximately 1,200 miles. For a B-25 that had been stripped and modified and loaded with extra fuel tanks, this was on the absolute outer edge of feasibility. There was no margin for error. There was no fuel for extended searching if the Chinese airfields proved hard to find. And there was certainly no fuel for a return trip to the carrier. The 16 B-25s and their 80 crewmen were going to Japan in one direction only. Now here is something that is absolutely crucial to understanding this mission, something that gets overlooked in many accounts because it requires sitting with an uncomfortable reality. The men who flew the Doolittle raid knew, going in, that the mission was in all likelihood a one-way trip. Not because they expected to die over Japan, though that was certainly possible, but because even if everything went perfectly, even if they evaded every Japanese fighter and every anti-aircraft battery and dropped their bombs and turned west without a scratch, they still had to cross the East China Sea with near-empty fuel tanks, find airfields in a war zone in darkness, and land safely in territory where they did not speak the language, where the infrastructure was minimal, and where Japanese forces were actively expanding their control. Doolittle himself, in his own calculations, estimated that the chances of a successful outcome were somewhere around 50%, and he may have been optimistic. Yet when he put out the call for volunteers, after explaining as much of the mission as he could reveal, every single man he had trained stepped forward. Every single one. The task force that assembled around USS Hornet was one of the most powerful naval forces the United States had deployed since Pearl Harbor. The Hornet itself was accompanied by the USS Enterprise, another fleet carrier, along with cruisers, destroyers, and the oiler Cimarron to refuel the task force at sea. The man commanding the naval portion of the operation was Vice Admiral William Halsey, one of the most aggressive and charismatic officers in the United States Navy, a man who had already become something of a public hero in the dark months following Pearl Harbor for leading carrier raids against Japanese-held islands. Halsey was the kind of commander who communicated in short, blunt, memorable sentences, and he had no doubt at all that this mission was worth the risk. He watched the 16 B-25s being loaded onto Hornet's deck with a mixture of admiration and something close to awe. They looked enormous on the carrier deck, far bigger than any aircraft that had ever been carried on a warship, their wings nearly touching each other, their noses pointed toward the bow and the vast, empty Pacific beyond. The task force sailed west on April 2, 1942, from Naval Air Station Alameda in San Francisco Bay. And if you could have been there on that dock watching them go, you would have known something important was happening even without knowing what it was. The Hornet's flight deck was covered with aircraft that should never have been there. Army bombers, clearly identifiable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The official explanation, if anyone asked, was that the Army was ferrying bombers to Hawaii. Nobody seems to have asked, or if they did, they kept what they saw to themselves. For the first 10 days of the voyage, the plan held together beautifully. The weather was rough at times, the kind of Pacific weather that makes you understand why sailors of the old age were so deeply religious, with swells that rolled the carrier through 30-degree arcs and spray that came over the flight deck in great cold curtains. But the ships held course, the engines held, and the B-25s sat on their deck chocks and rode out the weather. Down in the hold, Doolittle's men played cards, wrote letters they could not mail, sharpened their knowledge of Japanese target locations, and waited. Some of them, the younger ones especially, had that quality of focused calm that very young soldiers sometimes achieve precisely because they cannot fully comprehend what they are about to do. Others were older and more experienced and comprehended it perfectly and had decided to do it anyway, which is a different kind of courage entirely. Then, on the morning of April 18, 1942, at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, everything changed. The task force's radar detected a Japanese picket vessel, one of a network of small patrol boats stationed far out in the Pacific specifically to give early warning of exactly this kind of approach. The picket boat, later identified as the Nito Maru, had almost certainly detected the task force and was already broadcasting a warning to Tokyo. The task force was still approximately 650 miles from the Japanese coast. That was 200 miles further than planned. It meant the B-25s would need to fly 200 miles more than they had prepared for, 200 miles more on fuel tanks that were already calculated to the last gallon. It meant the mission had just gotten significantly more dangerous. It also meant there was no time to think about it. The decision had to be made immediately. Sink the Nito Maru, which was done, but she had already transmitted, and then launch immediately or abandon the mission entirely. Halsey sent a message to Hornet, launch planes, to Colonel Doolittle and Gallant Command. Good luck and God bless you. There was no deliberation. There was no committee. There was no second guessing. Within minutes, the order had gone out to every man aboard those 16 B-25s. They were going now, 200 miles early, at dawn instead of darkness, into waters that Japanese forces had now been warned about. They were going now. What happened on that carrier deck in the next few hours is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of military aviation, and it deserves to be described in full, because the physical reality of what those men accomplished that morning is easy to underestimate when you read it as a dry historical summary. The sea was running heavy. Waves that would have been impressive on any day were made more so by the task force's speed, because Hornet was driving hard into the wind to give the B-25s every knot of headwind they could use for lift. The deck was wet and moving, rising and falling in swells that could pitch the bow 15 feet up and then drop it 15 feet down in a matter of seconds. At the bow of the carrier, the deck officer stood with two checkered flags raised, watching the bow's movement, timing the pitch of the ship. His job was to drop those flags at precisely the moment the bow was rising, so that each B-25, as it rolled to the end of the deck and lifted into the air, would have the bow coming up beneath it rather than dropping away. This timing was everything. A few seconds wrong in either direction could send a 30,000-pound aircraft directly into the ocean. Doolittle's aircraft was first. He climbed into the left seat of his B-25, went through his checklist with his co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole, brought his two Wright Cyclone engines to full power, held against the brakes as the engines reached maximum revs, watched the deck officer and his flags, and when the flags dropped, he released the brakes and the aircraft began to roll. The B-25 had approximately 460 feet of deck ahead of it. For context, a standard B-25 normally needed at least 1,200 feet to take off from a land runway at its current weight, 460 feet. The aircraft accelerated. The bow dropped. The aircraft was nearly at the edge. The bow rose. Doolittle pulled back on the yoke, and the B-25 staggered into the air with perhaps 10 feet to spare above the churning Pacific, and the men on the carrier deck who had been holding their breath for the last 30 seconds let it out in a long collective exhalation that was equal parts relief and awe. Doolittle climbed away from the carrier and began circling, waiting for none of his other aircraft. The plan called for no formation flying until they were well away from the carrier. He turned west and disappeared into the overcast. The other 15 aircraft followed one by one, each takeoff a variation on the same terrifying theme. One aircraft had a close call that nearly ended in disaster. One aircraft had mechanical issues that its crew addressed with a calm professionalism that seems almost impossible to imagine under those circumstances. But all 16 aircraft got airborne. All 16 turned west, and none of them had any way to communicate with each other or with anyone else, because radio silence was absolute. 16 bombers, 80 men, disappearing into the Pacific morning on a course for the most heavily defended home islands in Asia. The flight west took several hours, and during that time the men in those 16 B-25s flew at low altitude, sometimes as low as 20 feet above the wave tops, to stay below Japanese radar coverage. Imagine that for a moment. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 200 miles an hour, 20 feet above the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in the morning overcast of April in the North Pacific, where visibility could drop with almost no warning, and where any navigational error could put you into the water without the slightest possibility of rescue. The crews had stripped their aircraft of nearly everything that wasn't essential to keeping them flying and keeping them armed. What remained was pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunner, an aircraft full of bombs and fuel, and the quiet, focused attention of men doing an extremely difficult job under extraordinary conditions. Japan appeared on the horizon ahead of them as a dark line against a gray sky, and then resolved into the specificity of coastlines, hills, the geometry of a country that looked absolutely peaceful from the air. And in fact, it was peaceful, because nothing like this had ever happened before, and the Japanese who looked up from their fields and their streets and their factory windows and their school playgrounds that morning saw American bombers and could not, at first, process what they were seeing. Some of them waved. Some of them stared. Air raid wardens in Tokyo, a city that had never been attacked in the entire history of its existence, saw the aircraft and did not immediately know what to do, because the idea that an American bomber could be over Tokyo was so far outside the realm of what they had been prepared for that their minds simply rejected the input for a moment. Doolittle's aircraft reached Tokyo at approximately noon local time, flying low over the rooftops, and dropped his bombs on military and industrial targets in the northern part of the city. The explosions were not enormous. 16 B-25s carrying a relatively small bomb load were not capable of destroying Tokyo. That was not the point. The point was that the bombs were falling. The point was that the sound of those explosions was rolling through the streets of the city that had never heard that sound before. The point was that the citizens of Tokyo, who had been told repeatedly and confidently that they were safe, that the Americans were too far away, that the Imperial Navy would prevent any such attack, were now running for shelter that had never been built because shelter had never seemed necessary. The psychological effect, in that moment, was incalculable. Japanese anti-aircraft fire came up across the city as the raid developed, heavy and sometimes accurate. Japanese fighters scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, though many had been stood down for the morning because the day happened to coincide with a large civil air defense exercise, and the irony of this is almost too perfect. Japan was practicing for an air raid when the actual air raid arrived. Some of the American aircraft were fired on by fighters, some were hit by anti-aircraft shrapnel, and the aviators responded by doing exactly what they had trained to do, dropping low, flying fast, using the urban terrain as cover when they could, and heading west as fast as their engines would carry them toward the coast and the sea beyond. All 16 aircraft made it out of Japan. All 16 crossed the East China Sea heading for China. And here is where the mission that had already been improbable became genuinely epic, because what happened next was not a clean, organized arrival at prepared airfields with ground crews and fuel trucks and hot food waiting. What happened next was a night of chaos and terror and survival that tested these 80 men in ways that the actual raid over Japan had not. The Chinese airfields they were supposed to land at were not ready for them. Communication failures, the compressed timeline of the early launch, and the general chaos of operating in a war zone had meant that the signal fires and radio beacons that were supposed to guide the crews in were not lit or not broadcasting. Night fell as the B-25s crossed the Chinese coast, and the crews found themselves flying over mountainous terrain in darkness and fog with fuel gauges approaching empty and no clear idea of exactly where they were. One by one, the aircraft either ran out of fuel and the crews bailed out over what they hoped was friendly territory, or made crash landings in fields and on hillsides and on beaches in conditions that would have been challenging in daylight and were genuinely terrifying in darkness. Doolittle's aircraft ran out of fuel over mountains in Zhejiang province, and he and his crew bailed out into the darkness, parachuting into terrain they could not see, landing scattered across hillsides in the rain. Of the 80 men, 71 survived the mission and eventually made it back to Allied control, though the paths they took to do so were sometimes extraordinary. Some were rescued almost immediately by Chinese civilians and soldiers who risked their own lives to hide and shelter the American airmen from Japanese search parties. Others evaded capture for days, walking through mountains, hiding in villages, guided by Chinese who could not speak a word of English and communicated entirely through gesture and mutual goodwill. The stories of individual escape and evasion from this mission could fill their own documentary, and some of them have, because the courage shown by Chinese civilians in hiding and helping American airmen, in the full knowledge that Japanese reprisals would be severe, represents one of the most moving dimensions of the entire Doolittle raid story. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces. Of those 8, 3 were executed by the Japanese military on what were later judged to be war crimes charges, killed under an emergency law that the Japanese government enacted specifically and retroactively to justify the executions. These 3 men, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942, in Shanghai. Their deaths were a deliberate and cold-blooded act of state terror, intended to send a message to the American military about the consequences of attacking Japan. The message it actually sent was rather different. One other captive, Lieutenant Robert Meader, died of illness and malnutrition in Japanese captivity in December 1943. The 4 surviving prisoners were held in brutal conditions until liberated at the end of the war. Doolittle himself, upon reaching the ground safely after his parachute landing, surveyed the situation and came to a conclusion that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He believed, in those first hours after landing, that the mission had been a failure, not because of what had happened over Japan, which he had no way of assessing in detail, but because all 16 of his aircraft had been lost. None of them had landed at the designated airfields. His men were scattered across hundreds of miles of Chinese mountain country, and he did not yet know how many had survived. He told the military attaché who eventually reached him that he expected to be court-martialed when he got back. The attaché told him, with complete confidence, that he was wrong. He was not court-martialed. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt personally, and he was promoted 2 full grades, skipping brigadier general entirely to Major General. The impact of the Doolittle raid on the Japanese war effort, in purely military terms, was limited but not negligible. Some industrial and military facilities had been damaged, but the military impact was never the primary purpose. The primary purpose was psychological, and on that level, the raid was a triumph that echoed through the entire subsequent course of the war in ways that are still being appreciated by historians 80 years later. In America, the effect was electric. News of the raid was released on April 21, 1942, and the response was unlike anything the country had experienced in the dark months since Pearl Harbor. For the first time since December 7th, the news was not about defeat, retreat, or surrender. It was about Americans striking back, about American bombers over Tokyo, about the fact that the war was not a one-way street. Roosevelt, when asked where the bombers had come from, given that their carrier origin was a military secret, said with a smile that they had come from Shangri-La, the mythical hidden valley from the James Hilton novel, and the answer became one of the most quoted lines of the war. The newspapers ran the story everywhere. The radio broadcast it everywhere. In a country that had spent 4 months absorbing nothing but bad news, the Doolittle raid was like oxygen to a suffocating man. The effect on Japan was, if anything, more strategically significant because of what it provoked rather than what it accomplished directly. The Japanese High Command had staked enormous prestige on the claim that the homeland was inviolable. The connection between the Doolittle raid and the Battle of Midway is not widely appreciated by general audiences, but it is absolutely fundamental to understanding why Midway happened when and how it did. The Japanese plan to capture Midway, Operation MI, was already under discussion when the Doolittle raid occurred. It was not yet finalized. There were factions within the Japanese high command, particularly in the Imperial Army, who saw Midway as a diversion of resources from more important objectives. After April 18, 1942, those factions were silenced. The shame and shock of the Doolittle raid gave Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku exactly the argument he needed to push Operation MI through, and it happened on the accelerated timeline he wanted, which meant that certain preparations, certain intelligence gathering, certain logistical precautions that might otherwise have been taken were not taken. And when the American carriers arrived at Midway in early June 1942, they were there in part because the Doolittle raid had told them, through signals, intelligence, and strategic logic, exactly where the Japanese were going. The raid over Tokyo on April 18th had set in motion a chain of events that ended in the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway on June 4th through 7th, 1942, the single most consequential naval battle of the Pacific War. There is also the matter of Japanese resources diverted to home defense. After the Doolittle raid, the Japanese military establishment could no longer simply assume that the home islands were safe. Fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries that might otherwise have been deployed to the Pacific perimeter were kept in Japan to defend against future raids that never came, at least not for another 2 years. The diversion was not enormous, but it was real, and in a war where margins were as thin as they were in 1942 and 1943, every fighter kept in Japan to guard against an unlikely threat was a fighter that was not hunting American ships or shooting down American carrier aircraft. But perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of the Doolittle raid was on the human beings who experienced it on both sides of the Pacific. For the 80 men who flew it, the experience became the defining event of their lives. Some of them went on to distinguished combat careers. Others spent the rest of the war as prisoners. 3 of them died for it. The survivors, when they gathered in the years after the war for their annual reunions, had a tradition that speaks to the nature of what they shared. They kept 2 silver goblets, engraved with each raider's name. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. At each reunion, the surviving members would pour champagne from a bottle that had been carried on the mission, open that bottle for the last time when only one raider remained, and drink a toast to those who had preceded them. The last of the original raiders, Richard Cole, who had been Doolittle's co-pilot on the lead aircraft, died in 2019 at the age of 103. The tradition was observed. The bottle was opened. The toast was made. For the Chinese civilians who helped the American airmen escape, the aftermath was catastrophic in ways that deserve more attention than they typically receive. When the Japanese military determined that Chinese civilians had aided the raiders, the reprisals were swift and savage. Japanese forces swept through the regions of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces where the raiders had come down, burning villages, executing civilians, destroying crops and infrastructure in a campaign of collective punishment that killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese people. The airfields that had been intended to receive the raiders were destroyed so thoroughly that they could not be used again. These casualties, vastly higher than anything suffered by the American raiders, represent the true human cost of the mission in ways that American histories of the Doolittle raid have not always fully acknowledged. The careers of the key figures who survived the raid are themselves a kind of history of American aviation and military power in the 20th century. Doolittle himself became one of the most distinguished commanders of the war. He led the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and most consequentially, the 8th Air Force in England, where he made a decision in January 1944 that arguably did more to determine the outcome of the air war over Europe than any other single command decision. He ordered American fighter escorts to stop protecting their bombers and instead go after the Luftwaffe wherever they found it, turning his P-51 Mustangs loose to hunt German fighters rather than simply shield American bombers. The result was the destruction of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps in the winter and spring of 1944 and the establishment of Allied air supremacy over Europe that made the D-Day invasion possible. Jimmy Doolittle, the man who had led 16 bombers off a carrier deck to bomb Tokyo, helped win the war in Europe too. The B-25 Mitchell bomber that he and his men flew became one of the most versatile and widely used aircraft of the entire war. It served in every theater, in every role, flown by American, British, Dutch, Australian, Canadian, Soviet, Brazilian, and Chinese crews. Over 10,000 were built. It remained in frontline service through the end of the war and in many air forces for years afterward. It is a beautiful aircraft, clean-lined and purposeful, and several examples survive in flyable condition today, appearing at air shows where they draw crowds who may not know the history but respond instinctively to the sound and sight of those two Wright Cyclone engines and that distinctive silhouette. The USS Hornet, the carrier that launched the raid, went on to fight at Midway and then at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, where she was sunk by Japanese air attack. She was the last of the pre-war American carriers to be lost in combat. The Japanese destroyers that attempted to sink her hulk with torpedoes after she had been abandoned found the task unexpectedly difficult. She had been built, like her crew, to be hard to kill. The name Hornet was given to a new Essex-class carrier that commissioned in 1943 and went on to serve with distinction through the rest of the Pacific War. The tradition of naming Navy carriers Hornet continues to the present day. What does the Doolittle raid mean at this remove of more than 80 years? What does it tell us about war and courage and the nature of decisive moments? There are several answers, and they are not all comfortable ones. The most obvious lesson is about psychological warfare and the importance of morale, both in sustaining your own forces and in shaking the confidence of your enemy. The raid did almost no material damage to Japan. What it did was demonstrate, at a moment when demonstration was desperately needed, that the United States was not beaten, was not going to accept defeat, was capable of striking back in unexpected ways at unexpected times and places. That demonstration was worth more than the material damage of 100 conventional bombing missions. There is also a lesson about innovation and the willingness to attempt the unprecedented. The Doolittle raid was conceptually impossible until someone noticed the painted outline of a carrier deck on a runway in Norfolk and asked a question that had never been asked before. What if we did the thing that cannot be done? The answer, in this case, was that you could do it if you were smart enough, brave enough, and willing to accept a level of risk that conventional military thinking would have rejected as unacceptable. The men who planned this mission were not reckless gamblers. They were rigorous, careful, mathematically precise people who had calculated every variable they could calculate and had then decided that the potential upside justified the known risk. That combination of rigor and audacity is rare in any organization, military or civilian, and it is worth recognizing and cultivating wherever it appears. There is also, and this is the uncomfortable part, a lesson about consequences. The Doolittle raid achieved its psychological objectives at a cost that fell largely on people who had no say in it. 250,000 Chinese civilians did not choose to be part of Operation Doolittle. They did not volunteer for the mission. They suffered Japanese reprisals not for anything they had done, but because of where they lived and because American bombers had come down in their vicinity. The moral calculus of this, in the context of a war in which Japanese forces had already killed millions of Chinese civilians in years of brutal occupation, is genuinely complex, and reasonable people can reach different conclusions about it. What is not reasonable is pretending those deaths did not happen, or that they were simply an acceptable cost of a mission that history has celebrated primarily in American terms. The Doolittle raid happened at a moment when the United States was facing something it had not faced before in its modern history, which was the genuine possibility of a long war that might not be won, against an enemy whose skill and ferocity and organizational capacity had been catastrophically underestimated. The raid did not win the war. It did not even come close to winning the war. But it demonstrated that the war was winnable, and in April of 1942, when almost every piece of news coming out of the Pacific suggested otherwise, that demonstration was perhaps the most important thing that American military power could have done. Jimmy Doolittle, in his later years, was asked many times what he considered the most important moment of his life, and he consistently deflected the question toward his men rather than himself. He said that the true heroes of the raid were not the commanders, but the crewmen, the young men who had volunteered without being told what they were volunteering for, who had trained intensively for a mission whose details were kept secret from them, who had climbed into their aircraft on a pitching carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and had flown west toward a country that had never been bombed before, with the full knowledge that they were unlikely to come back in any conventional sense of that phrase. He said that what those men represented was something specific to America at a specific moment, a particular combination of youth and courage and competence and irreverence that was, in his view, the most powerful military force in the history of warfare. He was not wrong. The final entry in the story of the Doolittle raid comes from a moment at the end of the war, after Japan had surrendered and American forces were moving into the country to begin the occupation. Some of the men who had been prisoners, the survivors of the 4 who had been kept alive through years of brutal captivity, were liberated by American forces in August 1945. And in the chaos of the surrender, in the collapse of the Japanese military apparatus that had seemed so invincible in April of 1942, one of those surviving prisoners looked out the window of his liberation aircraft as it flew south over Japan and saw below him the country they had come so far to bomb 3 years before. He said later that it looked peaceful. He said it looked ordinary. He said that seeing it from the air, he understood for the first time what Doolittle had always told them, that the mission over Tokyo had never really been about the bombs. It had been about the act, the decision, the willingness to go when everything said you shouldn't. The willingness to climb into your aircraft on a pitching carrier deck and roll toward the edge and trust that the bow would come up at the right moment and that you would be airborne over the Pacific on your way to do something that needed doing, regardless of what it cost. That is what the Doolittle raid was. That is what it means. 16 aircraft and 80 men in one April morning when the impossible turned out to be merely extraordinarily difficult. And extraordinarily difficult turned out to be something that extraordinarily determined people could accomplish. The bombs fell on Tokyo. The bow came up at the right moment. And the war, for the first time since December 7th, 1941, began to turn.